The cruelest thing he said that night was not "get out." It was "this was never your home." At 12:07 a.m., with rain sliding down the tall windows of the Caldwell estate, Grace Miller Caldwell stood in the marble foyer wearing the same soft gray sweater she had folded laundry in just 1 hour earlier. Her suitcase sat open on the floor where Ethan had dropped it, half-packed, one sleeve hanging out like a small white flag. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills of Westchester County, low and distant, but inside the house, the silence felt sharper than the storm. Ethan Caldwell stood by the front door in a black dress shirt, his jaw tight, his eyes cold in a way Grace had never seen before. He was the kind of man magazine covers loved to call self-made. 38 years old. Real estate millionaire. Owner of glass towers, luxury condos, and land people fought over in courtrooms. But that night, standing under the chandelier his father had chosen 20 years ago, he looked less like a king and more like a frightened man hiding behind anger. "I want you gone before sunrise," he said. Grace blinked once. Her fingers tightened around the small silver key in her palm. "Ethan, please. You need to listen to me." "No," he cut in, his voice quiet, which somehow made it worse. "I listened long enough. Vanessa showed me everything. The transfers. The withdrawals. The accounts you never told me about." Grace's breath caught, not because she was guilty, but because she finally understood the trap. Vanessa Reed, Ethan's former assistant, had always smiled with soft lips and sharp eyes. She had always stood too close, spoken too sweetly, planted doubt like it was concern. "Those were not withdrawals from you," Grace said carefully. "They were payments." Ethan gave a bitter laugh. "Payments? From what, Grace? You came into this marriage with nothing." The words landed hard. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just hard enough to split something inside her. For 2 years she had protected his pride like it was something fragile and living. She had watched bills arrive in red envelopes. She had seen him sit alone in the kitchen at 2 a.m., staring at foreclosure notices he thought she had never found. She had sold the little condo her mother left her, the only place that had ever belonged to her before this house, and she had done it quietly because Ethan once whispered, after too much bad news and not enough sleep, "I cannot lose this house, Grace. It is all I have left of my father." So she saved it. Month after month. Check after check. While he smiled at galas and shook hands under golden lights, she kept the roof over him. But now he was looking at her like she was a stranger who had broken in. He reached for the door and opened it. Cold rain rushed into the foyer, carrying the smell of wet leaves and midnight asphalt. Grace looked past him at the long driveway, the iron gates, the dark lawn shining under the storm. Then she looked back at the man she had loved enough to disappear inside his shadow. "You really believe I stole from you?" she asked. Ethan's face flickered for half a second, but pride moved faster than truth. "I believe what I saw." Grace nodded slowly. Her eyes burned, but she did not let a tear fall. Not in front of him. Not while he was still choosing everyone else's voice over hers. She bent down, zipped the suitcase with steady hands, and picked up the damp beige coat from the bench. Inside the pocket was a folded envelope, softened at the corners from being carried too long. Mortgage receipts. Bank confirmations. The proof of every month she had kept his world from collapsing. She could have thrown it at his feet. She could have opened it right there and watched his face change. Instead, she slipped it deeper into her coat and stepped toward the rain. At the threshold, Ethan said, "Leave the key." Grace stopped. For a moment, all she heard was the storm and the tiny ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. She opened her hand and stared at the silver key resting against her palm. Then she placed it gently on the entry table, beside the vase of white roses she had bought that morning. "Check the mortgage before you change the locks," she said. Ethan frowned. "What?" Grace looked at him one last time. Not with hate, not even with anger. With the quiet sadness of a woman who had finally seen the truth. "Check the mortgage, Ethan." Then she walked out into the rain, pulling her suitcase behind her, while the man who thought he owned the house stood in the doorway, completely unaware that by morning, he would discover she was the only reason he still had one. Grace did not remember the first mile. Later, she would try to piece it together by fragments, the wheels of her suitcase catching in the wet gravel, the iron gates opening behind her with a low mechanical groan, the cold rain running under her collar, the glow of the Caldwell estate shrinking behind the trees like a life she had imagined too well. She kept walking because stopping would mean feeling everything at once. The road outside the estate was narrow and dark, lined with old maples and stone walls that belonged to families who had owned land long before people like Grace were ever invited to dinner there. Her shoes were not made for rain. Her coat was too thin. By the time she reached the main road, her sweater clung to her skin, and her hands ached from gripping the suitcase handle. A car passed without slowing, its headlights sweeping over her face for one bright second before leaving her in darkness again. Grace almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because there was something painfully honest about being seen for 1 second and forgotten the next. That was how the whole marriage had begun to feel. At the small train station near Briarcliff Manor, the waiting room was closed, the ticket window dark, the platform empty except for a vending machine humming under a flickering light. The next train into Manhattan would not arrive for 47 minutes. Grace sat on a wooden bench beneath the awning and pulled the folded envelope from her coat pocket. The corner had gone soft from the rain, but the papers inside were still safe. She opened them with careful fingers. Mortgage confirmation. Tax notice resolved. Emergency transfer cleared. 11 months of proof stacked in quiet order. She touched the top page and saw not numbers but nights. Nights when Ethan thought she was asleep and she heard him in his study, pacing. Nights when he told investors everything was stable, while his company bled money behind polished conference room doors. Nights when Vanessa Reed brought files to the house and looked. By 7:15 a.m. The Caldwell estate looked untouched by the storm. Sunlight spread across the wet lawn in thin gold lines, the white columns gleamed, and the house stood at the top of the hill as if nothing unkind had happened beneath its roof. Ethan came downstairs wearing yesterday's shirt, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, his eyes shadowed from a night without sleep. He told himself he was tired because of the argument, because of the rain, because Grace had been difficult, not because the house felt wrong without her. But the wrongness was everywhere. The kitchen was silent. No coffee waited in the pot. No folded newspaper sat beside his place at the island. No small yellow sticky note reminded him that his 9:30 meeting had been moved to 10 o'clock, or that he always forgot his antacid when he had back-to-back investor calls. He opened a cabinet, found the coffee filters, and stared at them as if they belonged to someone else's life. Grace had never made a show of caring for him. She simply kept the day from falling apart. Quietly, invisibly. And now the silence had shape. His phone vibrated on the counter. Vanessa Reed. Ethan answered before the second ring. "Is it done?" she asked, her voice smooth, almost bright. Ethan looked toward the foyer, where the entry table stood with the vase of white roses and the silver key Grace had left behind. "She is gone." "Good," Vanessa said too quickly. Then she softened her tone. "I know that was hard. But you had to protect yourself. Women like Grace learn where the money is. Then they learn where to press." Ethan rubbed the bridge of his nose. The phrase should have comforted him. Instead, it irritated something deep in his chest. "Send the documents to my attorney," he said. "And call the locksmith." "Already arranged," Vanessa replied. "I can be there by 9. He did not answer right away. Through the tall windows, he watched a groundskeeper clear fallen branches from the driveway. Grace used to know that man's name. His daughter's name, too. Ethan never remembered either. "Fine," he said at last and ended the call. 15 minutes later, his office line rang. He almost ignored it until he saw the caller identification from Hudson Valley Mutual Bank. "Mr. Caldwell," a woman said, polite but cautious. "This is Marlene Ortiz from Mortgage Servicing. We are calling about the payment profile on the Caldwell estate." Ethan's shoulders tightened. "What about it?" "We received a request overnight to remove Mrs. Grace Caldwell from future payment authorization. Before we process that, we need confirmation regarding the existing account history." Ethan frowned. "Why would you need confirmation from me? It is my property." There was a brief pause. Paper shifted on the other end of the line. "Sir, the property title is under your name, but the active mortgage payments for the last 11 months have not been made from your primary business account." Ethan stood very still. "That is impossible." "I understand your concern," Marlene said. but the payments were maintained through an account ending in 4186. The authorized payer listed is Mrs. Grace Miller Caldwell. For a moment the house seemed to lose sound. No hum of the refrigerator. No distant mower. No rainwater dripping from the gutters. Just that name, spoken by a stranger, landing in the center of the room. Grace Miller Caldwell. Ethan gripped the edge of the desk. There must be a mistake. There are also several supplemental payments attached to tax escrow and a foreclosure prevention notice from last winter. Marlene continued gently. Those were resolved by Mrs. Caldwell as well. Last winter. Ethan remembered that week. He remembered sitting in his study with the lights off, staring at a letter he could not bring himself to open twice. He remembered Grace coming in with tea and asking, "Is there anything you want to tell me?" He had snapped at her, told her not to hover, told her he had everything handled. The next morning the notice disappeared. He thought his attorney had fixed it. He thought the bank had extended terms. He thought luck had finally returned. His mouth went dry. Send me the records. Because Mrs. Caldwell is the authorized payer, we cannot release full documentation without her written consent. However, you may visit the branch with identification for a limited review of property-related payment history. Ethan looked toward the foyer again. The silver key caught the morning light. Check the mortgage before you change the locks. The words came back, not loud, but clear enough to make him sit down. Vanessa arrived at 9:03, carrying a leather folder and wearing the expression of someone walking into a victory she had planned. "The locksmith is outside," she said. "Your attorney can file today if you sign these." Ethan did not take the pen. "Did you know Grace was paying the mortgage?" Vanessa's smile froze just slightly. "What?" "The bank called." He watched her face now, really watched it. Not the polished concern. Not the pretty sympathy. The flicker beneath it. "That cannot be right," she said. "Ethan, she probably moved money around to make it look that way." "From what money?" Vanessa looked away for half a second. Half a second too long. Ethan stood slowly. The house no longer felt empty. Felt full of questions. And somewhere between the silent kitchen and the silver key by the roses, the truth began to press against every lie he had chosen to believe. Ethan drove to Hudson Valley Mutual himself, not because he trusted the bank more than his own office, but because for the first time in months, he did not trust the version of the story he had been handed. The branch sat on Main Street between a pharmacy and a bakery, a modest brick building with blue awnings and a small American flag moving gently in the morning wind. It was the kind of place he normally sent assistants to handle. Too ordinary. Too slow. Too close to real people with real problems. Yet when he walked through the glass doors, the smell of coffee, printer paper, and rain damp wool made something in him feel strangely exposed. Marlene Ortiz met him near the front desk. A woman in her late 50s with silver reading glasses and the calm expression of someone who had watched many proud people discover numbers did not care about pride. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, offering her hand. "Thank you for coming in." Ethan gave a brief nod. "I want to review the mortgage history." "Of course. We can provide a limited account summary connected to the property." She led him into a small office with beige walls, a framed photo of the Hudson River, and two chairs that made his tailored coat look out of place. Ethan sat down while Marlene typed. Each click of her keyboard felt too loud. He told himself there would be a simple explanation. Grace had used a joint account. Grace had moved money temporarily. Grace had misunderstood something. Anything would be better than what his chest already knew. Marlene printed the first page and placed it in front of him. "These are the last 11 posted payments." Ethan looked down. April, May, June, July. Month after month, the payer line read Grace M. Caldwell. Not Caldwell Holdings. Not Ethan Caldwell Personal Reserve. Grace. The amounts were exact, paid on time, sometimes early, sometimes split into two transfers as if she had been gathering money from more than one place. His eyes moved faster, searching for a flaw. Instead they found more proof. Late fee reversed. Escrow shortage covered. Property tax deficiency resolved. Foreclosure prevention reinstatement completed. The words blurred for a moment. "Foreclosure prevention?" he asked, quieter now. Marlene folded her hands. "Last December, The loan entered a serious delinquency review. A reinstatement amount was paid 3 days before the deadline. Ethan's throat tightened. 3 days before the deadline. 3 days before the Winter Legacy Gala, where he had stood beneath crystal lights at the Plaza Hotel and accepted an award for leadership, stability, and generational vision. He remembered Grace beside the stage in a navy dress, clapping with tired eyes. He remembered whispering, "Smile. People are watching." She had smiled. She had just saved his father's house, and he had asked her to perform happiness. "Where did the money come from?" he asked. Marlene hesitated. "I cannot disclose private account details beyond what is tied to the property." "Please." The word surprised him. Came out without command, without status. "Just need." Marlene studied him for a long second, then turned the page around. "I can show you the memo lines attached to the transfers." Ethan leaned forward. On the largest payment, the memo read, "For the Caldwell home." On another, "December reinstatement urgent." On the final one, paid only 2 weeks earlier, the memo read, "Keep the lights on until he can breathe again." Ethan stared at that sentence. Suddenly he saw Grace in pieces he had ignored. Grace turning the study lamp off after he fell asleep in a chair. Grace quietly taking calls in the laundry room. Grace wearing the same winter coat for 2 seasons while telling him she did not need a new one. Grace asking him once very softly, "Would you hate me if I tried to help?" And him answering, "I do not need to be rescued." He had thought that made him strong. Now, sitting in a bank office under fluorescent lights, he saw what it really made him. Unreachable. His phone buzzed. Vanessa again. He declined the call. It buzzed a second time. He turned it face down. Marlene gathered the papers, but Ethan placed his hand lightly on the edge of the top page. "Can I have a copy?" "A summary copy, yes." As she prepared it, Ethan noticed a small note clipped to the file. It was not meant for him, only an internal service note, but his eyes caught Grace's name. Customer requested confidentiality. Does not want spouse contacted unless payment fails. Reason given. Preserving household dignity during business hardship. Preserving household dignity. Not hiding. Not stealing. Preserving. Ethan stood too quickly, then sat back down because his knees did not feel steady. The millionaire who owned towers across New York could not speak for several seconds. When he finally did, his voice had lost its sharp edges. "She told me to check the mortgage." Marlene looked at him with something close to pity. "Then I am glad you did." Outside the bank window, traffic moved slowly along Main Street, ordinary lives continuing under a pale sky. Ethan held the summary copy in both hands like it weighed more than the estate itself. For the first time since Grace walked into the rain, he understood that the house had never been proof of his success. It had been proof of her silence. And if Grace had paid to keep the lights on, then Ethan had spent 11 months living inside a love he was too proud to recognize. Ethan left the bank with the mortgage summary folded inside his coat, but the paper felt too alive to ignore. Every red light on Main Street seemed to hold him in place longer than necessary, forcing him to sit with the truth while strangers crossed the street with umbrellas and coffee cups and ordinary morning plans. Vanessa called 6 more times before he reached the Caldwell estate. He answered on the 7th. "Where are you?" she asked, no longer soft. "The locksmith is waiting, and your attorney needs signatures." Ethan looked at the wet road ahead, his reflection faint in the windshield. "Cancel the locksmith." Silence. Then a careful laugh. "Ethan, you are emotional. That is understandable, but changing the locks is standard procedure." "Cancel him," Ethan repeated, "and come to the office at noon. Bring every file you prepared on Grace." "Why?" The word came out too fast. "Because I want to see what you showed me." Another pause. This one told him more than any confession could. "Of course," Vanessa said at last. "I will bring everything." When Ethan arrived home, the front door still opened with the same key Grace had left behind. The foyer smelled faintly of white roses and rainwater. Her absence had settled into the rooms now, not as silence but as evidence. On the stairs, he noticed the runner she had once insisted on repairing instead of replacing. In the dining room, the silver candlesticks from his father's estate had been polished, though he had never asked. In the kitchen, a grocery list sat under a magnet shaped like a tiny house. Oatmeal, lemons, coffee, antacid. He touched the word antacid with one finger and closed his eyes. She had loved him in details so small he had mistaken them for air. At noon, Vanessa entered his home office wearing cream-colored wool and confidence she had not earned. She placed a leather folder on his desk. Everything is here. Bank screenshots, account notes, the transfer records I found. Ethan opened the folder. The pages looked convincing at first glance. Highlighted withdrawals, cropped account lines, typed notes suggesting Grace had moved money secretly. A month ago, he would have seen betrayal. Now he saw gaps. Dates missing. Sender lines cut off. Deposits separated from payments, so the story bent in only one direction. Where are the full statements? He asked. Vanessa crossed her arms. That is what I had access to. No, Ethan said quietly. This is what you wanted me to see. Her eyes sharpened. I protected you. From my wife paying my mortgage? Vanessa's mouth tightened. You do not understand what she was doing. Women like her know how to make sacrifice look noble after they take control. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. 4 years he had trusted Vanessa because she spoke the language of business. Risk exposure, asset protection, optics. Grace had spoken in softer words. Sleep, eat, breathe, come home safe. He had mistaken cold language for truth and warm language for weakness. You told me she was stealing. Vanessa leaned forward. Because she was taking power. There is a difference only if you are too sentimental to see it. The room changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But Ethan felt something inside him step back from her for good. Why did you want her gone? He asked. Vanessa looked toward the window, where the west lawn rolled down toward the old carriage house. The estate is over-leveraged. You know that. A private group is prepared to buy the property and lease it back through one of your subsidiaries. It would solve everything. Ethan's stomach dropped. What private group? She did not answer. He reached for the folder and found a proposal tucked behind the edited statements. There it was. Northline Capital Acquisition. A purchase structure. A consultant commission. Vanessa Reed. Listed under advisory compensation. You were going to profit from the sale of my father's house, Ethan said. Vanessa lifted her chin. I was going to save your company. By destroying my marriage. Your marriage was already a liability. Ethan stood. The word hit him harder than it should have because he recognized it. Liability. He had used that word himself about failing projects, bad loans, weak investments. Had he begun to think of Grace that way too? A woman who sold the only home her mother left her so his father's house could survive. A woman who walked into the rain with proof in her pocket and still did not humiliate him when she had every right to. He closed the folder. You are no longer authorized to act on behalf of Caldwell Holdings. Vanessa's expression cracked. You cannot be serious. I am. Ethan, without me, your investors will panic. Maybe they should hear the truth for once. He picked up his phone and called his attorney, keeping his eyes on Vanessa. David, suspend Vanessa Reed's access immediately. Full internal review. Preserve every communication connected to Grace, the mortgage, and Northline Capital. Vanessa went pale, but Ethan felt no victory. Only a deeper ache. Because exposing Vanessa did not erase the doorway. It did not erase the suitcase in the rain. It did not erase his voice saying, this was never your home. When Vanessa left, the house seemed to exhale. Ethan walked to the foyer and picked up the silver key from beside the roses. It was small, ordinary, almost weightless. Yet it carried more truth than every contract in his office. He closed his hand around it and whispered the first honest sentence he had spoken all day. Grace, what did I do? Ethan did not find Grace through the bank, the attorney, or the phone she refused to answer. He found her through the one person who had known the truth longer than anyone else. Margaret Ellis worked from a narrow law office above a bookstore in Tarrytown, with old oak floors, brass lamps, and walls lined with family property records going back 50 years. Ethan had met her only twice before, both times when his father was alive. Back then, Margaret had called him young man, even though he was already building his first luxury tower. Now, when he stepped into her office holding the mortgage summary and Grace's silver key, She looked at him over her glasses and did not offer coffee. "You are late," she said. Ethan swallowed. "Do you know where Grace is?" "Yes." "Will you tell me?" Margaret leaned back in her chair. "That depends. Are you looking for your wife? Or are you looking for forgiveness because your house suddenly feels empty?" The question landed with uncomfortable precision. Ethan looked down at the key in his palm. "I found out she paid the mortgage." "That is only the surface." Margaret opened a file drawer, pulled out a cream folder, and placed it on the desk between them. "Grace asked me not to show you this unless the marriage reached a legal separation. After last night, I would say we are close enough." Ethan sat. The folder contained closing documents for a small condominium in Queens. Grace Miller Cellar. The address meant nothing to him at first. Then he saw the handwritten note clipped to the first page. "My mother's place. Please make sure the funds clear before the Caldwell deadline." His chest tightened. She sold her mother's condo? Margaret's face softened, but her voice did not. The only property she owned outright. 712 square feet. Nothing impressive by your standards, I suppose. But to Grace it was safety. It was memory. It was the one door in this world nobody could close on her. Ethan closed his eyes. He remembered Grace mentioning the condo once, early in their marriage. A tiny kitchen. A loud heater. A window that faced a brick wall. She had smiled when she described it like people smile at humble things that love them well. He had barely listened. Margaret slid another page toward him. The sale proceeds went almost entirely into the reinstatement payment, escrow shortage, and back taxes on the Caldwell estate. Ethan stared at the numbers. His world had been saved by a home he had never bothered to visit. "Why did she not tell me?" he asked, though the answer was already there, waiting to shame him. Margaret's eyes sharpened. "Because you made your pride more important than her honesty. Because every time she reached for you, you turned your failure into a locked door." Grace was not afraid of being poor, Ethan. She was afraid of watching you become cruel just to feel successful. Cruel. The word did not shout. It did not need to. It sat in the room beside him like a witness. Ethan thought of the Winter Legacy Gala, the applause, the photographers, the award in his hand. He had called himself self-made while Grace stood in the crowd with the receipt of his rescue folded in her purse. He thought of the night before, her suitcase on the foyer floor, her face still and pale beneath the chandelier. He had not only sent her into the storm. He had sent away the person who had been holding the roof over him. "Where is she?" he asked again, and this time his voice broke around the edges. Margaret studied him for a long moment. "She took the early train into the city. She is staying at a women's residence on West 23rd Street for a few nights. Do not go there unless you can accept that she may refuse to see you." Ethan nodded. "I understand." "No," Margaret said. "You are beginning to understand. There is a difference." She picked up the silver key from his open hand, looked at it, then placed it back in his palm. "Do not bring her promises. Men like you have too many of those. Bring proof that you can live differently." By late afternoon, Ethan was in Manhattan, standing across from a brick building with green awnings and warm light in the downstairs windows. People passed around him carrying grocery bags, backpacks, folded umbrellas. The city moved at its usual speed, uncaring and alive. He saw Grace through the glass before she saw him. She sat at a small table near the lobby, wearing the same gray sweater from the night before, now dry but wrinkled, her hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck. In front of her was the rain-softened envelope. She was not crying. She was sorting the receipts into neat piles, like a woman putting her own life back in order. Ethan reached for the door, then stopped. For the first time, he did not walk in as if the world owed him entrance. He stood outside with the key in his hand and waited until Grace looked up. Their eyes met through the glass. Grace did not smile. She did not stand. She simply looked at him with the calm, tired eyes of someone who had loved deeply and survived being unseen. Ethan lifted the key slightly, not as a claim but as a confession. Grace looked at it, then back at him. And in that small pause between the street and the shelter, Ethan understood the first real cost of what he had done. The door was no longer his to open. Grace did not open the door. A woman at the front desk did. After looking at Ethan through the glass for nearly 10 seconds, as if measuring whether expensive shoes could still track mud into a place built for wounded hearts. "Can I help you?" she asked. Ethan glanced past her toward Grace. "I am here to speak with my wife." Grace stood before the woman could answer. Her face was calm, but Ethan saw the exhaustion beneath it, the kind no sleep could fix. "It is all right, Denise," she said softly. "We can talk outside." Ethan hated that word. Outside. One night earlier, he had made outside her punishment. Now she chose it as her protection. They stepped beneath the green awning, where the city moved around them in wet silver light. Taxis hissed along West 23rd Street. A delivery truck idled at the curb. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed into a phone, bright and careless, while Ethan stood in front of the woman who had sold her last safe place to save his. He held out the silver key. "I brought this back." Grace looked at it but did not reach for it. "That key opens a house, Ethan. It does not open trust." His fingers closed around it. "I went to the bank." "I know. And Margaret." Grace's eyes flickered then. Not surprise. Pain. "Then you know enough." "No," he said quickly, then stopped himself because quick words had ruined too much already. He lowered his voice. "I know what you paid. I know about your mother's condo. I know Vanessa lied. I know I believed her because it was easier than admitting I was failing." Grace looked toward the street. A drop of water fell from the awning between them. "You did not just believe her," she said. "You wanted to believe her. Because if I was the problem, then you did not have to look at yourself." Ethan had negotiated with banks, investors, city boards, and men who smiled while trying to take everything from him. None of them had ever left him as defenseless as Grace did with one quiet sentence. "You are right." She turned back to him. "Do you know what hurt the most?" He shook his head. "Not the suitcase. Not the rain. Not even the words." Her voice trembled, but she kept it steady. "It was how fast you were relieved to have someone to blame." Ethan felt the sentence settle into him like truth finally finding a place to land. He wanted to say he was sorry. The words were ready. But Margaret's warning stood between his mouth and his pride. "Do not bring her promises. Bring proof." "There is a charity gala tomorrow night," he said. "For the Hudson Housing Fund." Grace gave a small, tired laugh. "Ethan, I am not going to stand beside you in a dress and help you look decent. I am not asking you to." He took the folded mortgage summary from his coat. "Vanessa was planning to sell the estate through Northline Capital and take a commission. She edited your records. My attorney has started a review. Tomorrow the same investors who applauded me last winter will be there. So will Northline. So will Vanessa unless she decides to hide." Grace studied him carefully now. "What are you going to do?" Ethan looked at the papers, then at her. "Tell the truth publicly. All of it. That I was not stable. That the company was in trouble. That you saved the house. That I let people judge you while I stood on a reputation you paid to protect." For the first time, something in Grace's face shifted. Not forgiveness. Not warmth. But attention. "You would humiliate yourself in front of them?" "No," Ethan said. "I would correct the humiliation I gave you." The answer seemed to move through her slowly. Behind the glass, Denise watched from the lobby, pretending not to. Grace folded her arms, not coldly, but as if holding herself together. "And after that?" she asked. "After that, you owe me nothing." Ethan's voice dropped. "Not a return. Not forgiveness. Not a conversation. I just should have defended you when you were my wife. Since I did not, I will defend the truth now." Grace looked down at the envelope in her hands. The rain softened proof she had carried through the night. "I used to think if you knew how much I loved you, you would finally feel safe enough to love me back." Ethan's eyes burned. "Grace. But love should not require a woman to disappear." He nodded because there was nothing else honest enough to do. The wind moved between them. A cab pulled up, splashing water near the curb. Grace stepped back toward the door, then paused. "I will come tomorrow," she said. Ethan looked up. "You will." "Not for you." Her voice was gentle but firm. "For the woman you threw out. She deserves to hear the truth spoken in a room that once praised the lie." Then she walked inside, leaving Ethan beneath the awning with the key in one hand and the mortgage papers in the other. Through the glass, he watched her return to the small table, straighten the receipts and sit down alone. The door had opened but not for him. Not yet. Tomorrow, in a ballroom full of polished smiles and quiet cruelty, Ethan would finally have to choose between the image that built him and the truth that could make him human. The Hudson Housing Fund Gala filled the ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel with warm chandeliers, white tablecloths, and the soft clink of forks against china. Outside, Manhattan was still wet from an afternoon rain. But inside, everything sparkled as if hardship were something that only existed far away from crystal glasses and polished shoes. Ethan stood near the stage in a charcoal suit, listening to donors praise resilience while his own hands felt cold. Across the room, investors from Caldwell Holdings moved in small circles, speaking in lowered voices. Northline Capital had a table near the front. Vanessa Reed sat there in a black dress, her posture perfect, her smile controlled. When she saw Ethan watching her, she lifted her glass as if nothing had changed. Then the side doors opened and Grace walked in alone. She wore a simple navy dress, the same color she had worn at the Winter Legacy Gala. But this time there was no tired smile arranged for someone else's comfort. Her hair was pinned back. Her face was calm. In her hand was the rain-softened envelope. Conversation shifted when people recognized her. Some looked away. Some leaned closer to whisper. Vanessa noticed and rose from her chair with practiced concern. "Grace," she said, just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I am surprised you came. After everything, I thought you would want privacy." Grace stopped beside the registration table. Privacy is different from being silenced. A few heads turned. Vanessa's smile tightened. "Of course. I only meant this might be uncomfortable, considering the financial confusion." The word confusion floated gently, but its purpose was sharp. Ethan saw it then, how easily Vanessa could poison a room without raising her voice. Grace's fingers tightened around the envelope, but she did not answer. She did not need to. Ethan crossed the ballroom before Vanessa could say more. Not fast. Not angry. Just certain. He stopped beside Grace, but he did not touch her, did not claim her, did not perform closeness he had not earned. He simply faced the room. "There was no financial confusion," he said. The conversations around them thinned into silence. Vanessa's eyes flashed. "Ethan, this is not the place." "It is exactly the place," he said. The event chair was calling him to the stage anyway, expecting a speech about partnership and community investment. Ethan walked up the steps with the mortgage summary in his hand instead of the polished remarks his public relations team had prepared. From the podium, the ballroom looked enormous. White flowers. Gold light. Hundreds of people who believed success was always clean if the suit was expensive enough. Grace stood near the back now, still holding her envelope, her face unreadable. Ethan looked at her first. Then he looked at everyone else. "Last winter, many of you applauded me on a stage very much like this one," he began. "I accepted an award for stability, leadership, and vision. I let you believe Caldwell Holdings was stronger than it was. I let you believe I was stronger than I was." A murmur moved through the room. Vanessa sat frozen. "The truth is, my company was under pressure. The Caldwell estate, my father's home, was close to foreclosure review. And the person who saved it was not me." He lifted the paper. "It was my wife, Grace Miller Caldwell." The room went completely still. For 11 months she made the mortgage payments. She covered escrow shortages, tax deficiencies, and the reinstatement amount that kept the house from being lost. She did it from her own funds. She did it quietly because I was too proud to admit I needed help. Grace lowered her eyes, but Ethan kept going. His voice did not shake now. It steadied with every truth. Recently, edited financial records were used to make her look dishonest. Those records were incomplete and misleading. An internal review has begun, and anyone involved in manipulating them or attempting to profit from the sale of my family property will be removed from my company and referred to counsel. Northline's table shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa stood as if to leave, but 2 members of Caldwell Holdings' legal team stepped toward her with calm professionalism. No scene. No shouting. Just consequence. Ethan turned back to the ballroom. "I am not saying this because I want sympathy. I am saying it because I allowed a good woman to be judged in rooms where I should have protected her. Worse, I judged her first. He looked at Grace again, and this time the whole room followed his gaze. Grace did not take from me. She carried what I was too ashamed to hold. She did not steal my house. She kept it alive. The silence after that was not empty. It was heavy with people reconsidering every whisper they had repeated. Then Margaret Ellis, seated near the aisle, began to clap once. Slowly, deliberately. Others joined. Not the loud applause of charity performance, but something quieter. Almost embarrassed, almost human. Grace did not smile. Tears shone in her eyes, but she stood straight. Ethan stepped down from the stage, walked toward her, and stopped several feet away. "You deserve to hear that in public," he said softly. Grace looked around the ballroom, at the faces that had once measured her worth by his money, then back at him. "Yes," she said. "I did." Vanessa was escorted toward a private side room with the legal team. Her perfect smile gone. Northline's representatives were already making calls. The lie had not exploded. It had simply lost oxygen. And in the middle of that glittering room, Ethan realized telling the truth had not ruined him the way he feared. It had stripped away the performance. It had left him smaller maybe but real. Grace turned toward the exit. Ethan did not follow immediately. He watched her walk beneath the chandeliers, no longer his shadow, no longer his shield. This time when she reached the door, she did not look abandoned. She looked free. And Ethan understood that justice was only the beginning. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would have to be earned in quieter rooms, long after the applause faded. For 3 months after the gala, Grace did not move back into the Caldwell estate. Ethan did not ask her to. That was the first thing he learned. Love that had been pushed out into the rain could not be called home with one public apology, no matter how honest it sounded under chandeliers. Grace rented a small studio on West 71st Street with a radiator that clanked at night and a kitchen barely wide enough for 2 people to stand in. She bought a second-hand desk, taped her mother's old note above it, and began building something that belonged only to her. By spring, the sign on the glass door read Miller House Financial Advocacy, a small office for women who needed help understanding bank statements, housing documents, hidden debt, and the quiet ways money could become control inside a marriage. Grace did not call it revenge. She called it translation. She knew what it felt like to stare at papers that could change your life, while someone powerful told you not to worry your pretty little head about numbers. Now she sat beside women at folding tables, highlighted mortgage lines, explained escrow shortages, called banks, and reminded them that asking questions was not betrayal. Ethan came every Friday at 5:30 p.m. At first, he stood awkwardly in the doorway with coffee he had learned to order the way Grace liked it. Medium oat milk, no sugar. He did not bring flowers. He did not bring jewelry. He brought printer paper, repaired a crooked bookshelf, assembled chairs, and took out trash without being asked. When a pipe under the sink leaked, he arrived in rolled-up sleeves and spent 2 hours under the cabinet following instructions from a hardware store video. Grace watched from the doorway, arms folded, trying not to smile when he bumped his shoulder and whispered, "I deserve that." He also changed in places she could not see. Caldwell Holdings released a corrected investor statement. Northline Capital withdrew from the estate proposal. Vanessa Reed's contract was terminated after the review confirmed misconduct, and the matter was handled through attorneys with the quiet finality of consequences that did not need a spectacle. Ethan sold 2 luxury properties he had once kept for pride and used the proceeds to repay Grace for the condo she had lost, with interest, though she left the check untouched for weeks. More important than the money was the deed he placed on Margaret Ellis's desk. Half of the Caldwell estate transferred to Grace, legally, permanently, without conditions. When Margaret called to tell her, Grace sat very still, then asked, "Did he say why?" Margaret answered, "He said walls should never belong only to the person loudest inside them." Summer arrived slowly. The estate changed too. Ethan stopped calling it his father's house and started calling it the place he needed to stop hiding in. He opened the West Wing for community housing fund meetings. He turned the old carriage house into a free legal clinic 2 Saturdays a month, staffed by volunteers Margaret knew. He moved out of the master suite for a while and slept in the smaller room overlooking the garden, because, as he told Grace one evening, "I needed to learn the house without pretending I owned every inch of it." Grace listened, but she did not rush back. Trust returned like light through blinds in narrow lines, then wider ones. One Friday in late August, Ethan came to Miller House and found Grace locking up. The city was warm, the sidewalks glowing after a brief rain, and for once neither of them seemed to be carrying the whole past between them. "Walk with me," he asked. She nodded. They ended up at a small neighborhood diner, the kind with vinyl booths, blueberry pie under glass, and a waitress who refilled coffee without ceremony. Ethan looked around and said, "I like it here." Grace raised an eyebrow. "You used to complain if a restaurant did not have valet parking. I used to confuse comfort with importance." She looked down at her coffee, and something soft passed over her face. "And now?" Ethan reached into his coat pocket and placed the silver key on the table between them. Not pushed toward her. Not offered like a solution. Just placed there where both of them could see it. "Now I know a key is not ownership. It is permission. And I do not want to walk through any door you have not opened." Grace stared at the key for a long time. The same key she had left beside white roses. The same key he had carried like a confession. Outside, traffic moved along Amsterdam Avenue, ordinary and alive. She picked it up, feeling its familiar weight against her palm. "I do not want to go back to the way things were," she said. Ethan's eyes held hers. "Neither do I. The estate is too big," she said. "Too full of old ghosts. Then we sell it." She blinked. "Just like that." He smiled faintly. "Not just like that. With paperwork, inspections, probably 3 arguments about the price." For the first time in months, Grace laughed, small but real. The sound hit Ethan harder than applause ever had. They did sell the estate that fall. Part of the money funded Miller House for 5 years. Part went into a scholarship in Grace's mother's name. And with what remained, Ethan and Grace bought a smaller home in a quiet town along the Hudson. A white 2-story house with a blue front door, a porch swing, and a kitchen window that faced open sky instead of brick. Both names went on the deed. Both keys were cut on the same day. On the first night there, boxes still unpacked and takeout containers on the counter, Grace stood in the doorway watching Ethan struggle to hang a crooked picture frame. He stepped back, studied it, and said, "It is not perfect." Grace walked beside him and tilted the frame slightly until it straightened. "No," she said. "But it is ours." Ethan looked at her, not as a man trying to reclaim what he had lost, but as someone finally grateful to be invited into what remained. Grace opened her hand and showed him the silver key resting there. No longer a wound, no longer proof, just a beginning. "Come home," she said. And this time home was not marble floors, iron gates, or a mortgage paid in secret. It was 2 people standing in a small warm room, choosing honesty over pride, respect over performance, and a love that did not need anyone to disappear in order to survive.